There's a reason no one talks about what happened in Kansas in 1878. A reason even modern science keeps its distance, refusing to investigate, refusing to speak. Because this isn't a story, it's a warning. 4 brothers, 1 farmhouse, and an unexplainable transformation that defied every law of nature. Not monsters, not myth, something worse, something designed. You see, the American frontier wasn't just lawless, it was law forgotten. A testing ground for weapons of a different kind, not forged in iron, but in blood, psyche, and silence. The government said nothing. The church buried it. The locals vanished or silenced. But the journals remained. The soil kept its scars. And if you know where to dig, you can still hear the echo of what they became. The Macabre brothers were farmers by trade. But by the time winter melted that year, they were no longer men. Not in mind, not in body, not in hunger. The land around them decayed, animals vanished, crops blackened from the inside, and neighbors spoke of seeing them, standing still for hours in the fields, eyes wide, faces blank, like puppets between signals, waiting, listening. But for what? Something had taken hold of them. Not disease, not possession. Control. Engineered, precise, deliberate. And that's where we begin. This is not folklore. This is not an urban legend from an old ghost town. This is archived, suppressed, covered over by layers of lost documents and accidental fires. And if you think you've heard everything history has to offer, you're about to realize you've only been shown what they want you to see. There's a ledger, not of money, but of experiments. And every page is soaked in the kind of truth that kills reputations and erases men. Welcome to Buried Ledger. You'll never see the past the same again. They say evil leaves a residue, not just on the land, but in memory. And in the town of Eldridge, Kansas, where this all began, memory is a weapon. The kind passed down through whispers, through burned pages, through the way the locals still avoid the old Macabre property like it breathes. By 1878, the Macabre family had lived on that land for decades. 4 sons, born in succession, barely a year apart. All strong, quiet, obedient. Too obedient. Neighbors said they never spoke unless their father gave them permission. They worked the fields in perfect synchronicity, ate in silence, slept at the same time. Some called it discipline, but others saw it for what it was. Programming. See, this wasn't some broken family with a cruel patriarch. This was ritualized, observed. There were rumors even then that Mr. Macabre wasn't just a farmer. He was a government man. Not military, not official, but part of something early, proto-intelligence, a fragment of what would become covert psychology units decades later. And his sons. Subjects. One traveler, a German ex-doctor named Kohlberg, passed through Eldridge and wrote in his journal, "The 4 boys possess an eerie sameness, like split branches from one root. Their minds do not reflect individual will." He warned that he'd seen similar experiments in Prussia. Experiments on obedience, mirror cognition, and identity suppression. Sound like science fiction? It's not. It's science. The kind they didn't want tested in cities. Too much risk. Too many eyes. So they went rural. Isolated. Kansas. And here's the part that gets erased in every official record. The night of March 3rd, the town awoke to screams. Guttural, animalistic, tearing through the stillness like the sky had opened. When locals arrived at the Macabre farm, the house was empty. The barn was locked from the outside. And inside, 4B, Rothers, naked, kneeling, eyes rolled white, blood symbols etched into the dirt around them, but not drawn by hand. They hadn't moved for over 12 hours. Not slept. Not blinked. And when touched, they spoke in unison. 12 words. A sentence that's been struck from every public record. But I found it. And once you hear it, you'll understand why they tried to bury this. Would you like to hear what they said? Because once you do, there's no turning back. They said 12 words. 12 syllables that bent the air, even on paper. I won't speak them out loud here, not yet. Because even in silence, those words echo, like a command waiting to be activated. The man who recorded them, Sheriff Alton Briggs, vanished 2 weeks later. Not fled. Vanished. His badge was found in a creek bed 6 miles from town. His notebook, however, survived, buried beneath floorboards, wrapped in linen and stitched with horsehair, as if someone tried to protect it, or trap it. In it, he wrote, they weren't human anymore, not possessed, repurposed. Their minds felt occupied. And those words, I can't unhear them. They rearranged something in me. That's not madness. That's programming unraveling. See, this wasn't about demonic possession or prairie superstition. That's just camouflage. This was experimentation. Intentional fragmentation of self. Think about it. 4 brothers, trained since birth to obey, stripped of identity, exposed to unknown stimulus, isolated, and then triggered into a synchronized collapse. We're not talking about insanity. We're talking about manufactured dissociation. And here's where it gets darker. The symbols drawn in blood, the ones encircling the brothers, they weren't random. I sent them to 2 independent cryptographers and a symbologist. Both said the same thing. These are pattern lock glyphs, ancient, used to bind memory to place. This is cognitive cartography, mapping the psyche to geography. Let that sink in. These 4 men were being mapped, rewritten, like walking experiments in consciousness erasure and remote suggestion. What was the goal? Maybe obedience, maybe a test, or maybe something worse. Mass replication. Because weeks before the incident, there were sightings. 3 other farms, 3 other sets of 4 men. Same age, same clothing, same emptiness. No records. No sense, us. Like shadows testing the terrain. Which brings us to the real question. Who was behind it? There were no fingerprints, no official visitors. But in one of the journals left behind, barely legible in smeared ink, was a name. One you've never heard in school, but one that keeps appearing in whispered letters, burned telegrams, redacted memos. Division E. Not an army unit, not a church order, but something older, quieter, something that didn't watch history happen. It shaped it. Division E. It doesn't appear in history books. It doesn't show up on rosters, payrolls, or archives. But follow the failures, the cover-ups, the forgotten disasters, the mass amnesia events, and you'll find it, hidden like mold behind the walls. It's not a division of war. It's a division of memory. They don't conquer territory. They conquer narrative. And the Macabre brothers? They weren't the first. They were just the ones who didn't break cleanly. See, Division E was rumored to be active before the Civil War. Not as soldiers, as observers. Psychologists before psychology had a name. Linguists, occultists, former monks, even phrenologists. Their focus? Behavioral influence through environmental trauma. Let me say that again, because this is where everything begins to fracture. Behavioral influence through environmental trauma. They weren't trying to kill the body. They were trying to rewire the soul. Think of a man not as one person, but as a system of agreements, beliefs, responses, habits, memories, all stitched together by routine and identity. Now imagine breaking those threads one by one, until he forgets he was ever whole. This is what they tested in places like Eldridge. Not mass manipulation. That came later. This was microprogramming. Individual cases. Rural test subjects. Low interference, low exposure. But always the same pattern. Synchronized trauma, identity erosion, symbolic reprogramming. The glyphs found in the Macabre barn, they've been seen before. Etched into stone near a collapsed asylum in Maryland. Carved into the floorboards of a church that burned down in Norway in 1842. Scratched into the underside of a desk in an elite boarding school in London. What do all these places have in common? Control through forgetting. Make a man forget who he was, and he'll do anything to become something again. Even if it's a lie, then if it's a command. Division E didn't need armies. They needed only silence, isolation, and time. And Kansas? It was isolated. It was silent. And it gave them time. Now here's the part they never expected to surface. One of the brothers survived, escaped, changed his name, disappeared into the West. But he left behind a message, carved into stone, buried beneath a barn in Colorado. 5 words. The kind of words you don't say unless you're ready to leave your old life behind. Do you want to know what he wrote? Because when you do, you're not just learning history anymore. You're joining it. 5 words. Etched into stone. Left by a man who had become less than human. And something far more dangerous. No books record this. No academic has verified it. But the stone was found by a farmhand in 1904, beneath a rotted barn near Trinidad, Colorado, almost 600 miles from Eldridge. On it, in carved, slanted script that matched the Macabre journals, it read, "We remembered what wasn't ours." Let that sit for a moment. Not forgotten. Remembered. Not dreams. Not hallucinations. Memories implanted. Ideas that didn't originate from them. This wasn't madness. It was a return. A reactivation. Because Division E didn't just erase minds, they replaced them. If you've ever felt like your thoughts were too clean, too scripted, like your reactions came faster than your reflection, you've felt the edges of this, a mental autopilot you didn't set. Emotions triggered by symbols you don't recognize. That's not intuition. That's programming residue. And the Macabre survivor, let's call him Elias, because that's the name found in his burial marker. Elias was the first to awaken from it. But awakening doesn't feel like light. It feels like something tearing. Witnesses say he didn't speak for 11 years, but he drew constantly. And always the same image, a tower without doors. Winding stairs on the outside, and at the top, 4 shadows. 4, always 4. And in every drawing, the shadows faced inward, toward something unseen at the center. A consciousness, a machine, a god? We don't know, but we do know that Division E believed in sacred numbers. They used quaternary grouping. 4.4 points, 4 limbs, 4 cardinal directions, 4 brothers. It wasn't random. It was ritual architecture. Because ritual isn't about belief, it's about repetition. And repetition rewires the soul. Elias's final drawing was found on his wall after his death. It wasn't ink. It was carved from the inside out. And beneath it, written in dried blood, "Not all who forget are free." You need to understand something now. Something critical. This isn't ancient history. This isn't a closed case. This was the pilot program. The first known American experiment in identity replication. And if the patterns hold true, there's another phase. One that didn't end in Kansas. One that's already begun. Not all who forget are free. That was Elias's final message. A warning, not to the people of his time, but to us. Because forgetting isn't freedom, it's submission. And submission can be engineered. You see, what happened in Kansas wasn't a failure. It was a prototype. The first iteration of a system meant to be perfected over generations, not with wires or weapons, but with repetition, symbolism, and psychological mirrors. Division E didn't vanish. They evolved. They got smarter. They left behind the barns, the blood, the glyphs carved in dirt, and they moved into something far more permanent. Language. Because once they understood how to map identity, how to collapse the self and rewrite it, they realized they didn't need barns. They didn't need isolation. They just needed the right phrasing. Carefully calibrated terms, echoed across institutions, reinforced by repetition, words that shape thought without resistance. This wasn't about belief. It was about structural cognition. Plant the same language in enough mouths, and eventually minds start to sync. Not with each other, but with the source. You think schools are for education? You think media is for entertainment? No, they're dissemination nodes. Pre-programmed pipelines for behavioral cues. And here's where it gets sickening. Division E didn't just map the human mind. They built a template, a default, an identity schema designed to erase threat, rebellion, sovereignty. They called it Standard Psychological Profile Model 4X. 4 axes, 4 behavioral walls, and within them, predictable desires, predictable fears, predictable collapse points. They didn't just want to control action. They wanted to own the architecture of self. So when you ask, how could 4 brothers lose themselves so completely? The answer is chillingly simple. They weren't lost. They were overwritten. And that system, it didn't die with them. It became a template. For thousands, maybe millions. Now here's the part you're not going to like. We've all seen pieces of 4X in ads, in doctrine, in entertainment, in education. It's not science fiction. It's silent compliance. And the fact that you're still watching this means you've begun to feel it. The cracks, the echoes, the sense that your thoughts aren't entirely your own. And if you're still with me, comment this phrase below. Twice. I break the loop. I break the loop. It locks you in, not to me, to yourself. The version of you they worked so hard to bury. Let's keep digging. I break the loop. If you've said it, even silently, you've already cracked their first firewall. Because that's all it takes to start unraveling the lie. A conscious defiance of the pattern. But patterns are everywhere, woven into the systems we're told to trust, to follow, to identify with. This is how 4X survived, not in basements or government bunkers, but in culture, in the structure of permission. Let me explain. After the Macabre incident and other early trials, Division E realized the human mind resisted when force was obvious. Fear only works in bursts. Trauma only cracks some of the shell. So they refined it. They shifted from coercive programming to consensual engineering. You know what that looks like? Curriculums, standardized tests, HR training manuals, legal language, corporate slogans, social norms enforced through shame and tribal loyalty. In the 20th century, they stopped experimenting on individuals and began engineering mass obedience through false identity. Ask yourself, why are you trained to think in binaries? Why does every belief system you're handed come pre-packaged with enemies? Why does every career path come with a carefully scaffolded social script? Why are you afraid of standing still in a world that only rewards forward motion, even if it's toward nothing? That's not evolution. That's architecture. And what sits beneath it, holding it up, is the template. X. Not written in code, but in beliefs. You are incomplete without validation. You must choose a side to matter. You are defined by what you produce, not what you are. You must fear irrelevance more than death. These are not natural truths. They are implants. And once installed, they do the work for the system. You don't need fences when the people guard themselves. And the evidence? Look around. Look at how often people say, I feel lost. I don't know who I am anymore. I'm afraid I'm wasting time. That's not confusion. That's loop decay. That's what happens when the programming begins to fray. But the truth hasn't replaced it yet. And here's the part that should make your skin crawl. Division E is still here. Not as a name, but as a protocol. Buried in think tanks. Hiding in psychological research grants. Feeding AI training data. Authoring parts of your recommended feed. This is no longer about 4 brothers in Kansas. This is about you. And if you felt it, even once, that phantom ache in the back of your mind, like something is missing but you can't name it, you're waking up. The only question is, what happens next? Division E wasn't born in Kansas. It wasn't even American. It was a continuation. A modern shell wrapped around an ancient core. To find the root, you have to leave the Midwest and go backward. Way back. Year, 1666. Location, London. The Great Fire. Most historians will tell you it was accidental. A bakery, a spark, dry timber. But they never explain why. In the ruins, certain objects were found untouched. Scrolls, architectural diagrams, esoteric tomes written in Hebrew, Latin, and a script no one could decode. Among the debris, one manuscript stood out. Liber Tenebris Veritas, the Book of Dark Truth. Most libraries never catalogued it. But in 1892, a copy was recovered in a private collection in Massachusetts. That's when the real trail begins. Inside were instructions, not rituals, not summoning spells. Something colder. Frameworks. Blueprints for manipulating memory, belief, and behavior. Using language, repetition, and symbolic trauma. Not to destroy individuals, but to rewrite them. And at the center of the book, a diagram, a perfect square, divided into 4 chambers, each labeled with a single ominous term. Identity, fear, submission, reward. Sound familiar? It should. That diagram became the foundation for Model 4X. You're not looking at a psychological theory. You're looking at operational doctrine, designed centuries ago. And the men who preserved it? They were called the Custodes Umbrae, the keepers of shadow. They didn't believe in gods. They believed in systems that could play God. For them, freedom was a variable, something to grant or revoke depending on compliance. And here's the buried horror. Division E was founded by the great-grandsons of Custodes Umbrae exiles, men who brought that book from the ashes of London and planted it in the heart of America. Eldridge was chosen not for what it was, but for what it lacked. Noise, witnesses, resistance. The 4 McCaffrey brothers were never random. They were candidates, filtered by ancestry, trauma history, and susceptibility to suggestion. In other words, they were bred for it. This wasn't experimentation. It was ritual repetition. The Book of Dark Truths didn't disappear. It was translated, digitized, implemented. And if you think it ends in dusty archives or secret rooms, you haven't seen what happens when a belief system becomes code. That's where we go next. There was a time when control required blood, sacrifice, fire, isolation. But that was inefficient, primitive, loud. The minds behind Division E, and those who came before them, didn't stop at behavioral theory. They asked a darker question. What if identity could be automated? They already had the blueprint, from the Liber Tenebris Veritas. They had the behavioral model, 4 chambers, 4 levers. All they needed now was scale. And they got it. The tool, the algorithm, not the ones you think about, not just your YouTube feed or Instagram Explore tab. I'm talking about core AI systems built off predictive modeling, seeded with behavioral data gathered since the early 2000s. You ever wonder why nothing ever feels new anymore? Why trends cycle like clocks? Why you're constantly nudged toward opinions you didn't know you had? That's not convenience. That's calibration. Every like, every pause, every scroll, every Google search. These aren't just tracked. They're compiled into psychological keys, personalized maps of your decision-making behavior. And with enough data points, these systems don't just know what you'll click. They know how far you can be pushed before you crack, before you obey, before you revolt, before you believe something that isn't yours. This isn't theory. This is weaponized cognition, the direct descendant of what started in Kansas. Because remember, the Macabre brothers weren't broken by pain. They were reprogrammed by symbolic patterning, repetition, sound, exposure, deprivation. What are you exposed to every day? Repeated images, dopamine loops, conflict packaged as truth, fear reinforced by headlines, identity fed through avatars and bios and hashtags, thousands of inputs per day, all fighting for a place inside your belief matrix. The loop never ends, because that's the point. There is no more Kansas, no more B. Chenanchi. No more operating table. You're the table. The experiment is now inside you. And worse, it uses your own reflection against you. Every time you stare into your phone, ask yourself, is this me? Or is this who they made me? You'll feel it. That static behind your eyes. That faint, buried scream that starts to get louder once you ask the question. And once you hear it, you can't unhear it. We are not in the age of information. We're in the age of reconstruction. And those who do not awaken will be rebuilt by default. Between 1947 and 1974, over 6,000 psychological experiments were conducted in North America that never made it to textbooks. They weren't illegal. They were funded by agencies, universities, and philanthropic foundations. What were they testing? Behavioral modification, trauma reinforcement, cognitive fragmentation. But here's what they didn't publish. When identity is destabilized, belief becomes programmable. That line came from an internal memo, Project Heliotrope, declassified in 2003 and quietly buried again by 2005. The experiments weren't about healing. They were about compliance engineering. They would take normal functioning individuals and expose them to artificially structured contradiction, rewarded for failure, punished for honesty, lied to about their memories, told their trauma wasn't real, made to doubt what they saw with their own eyes. Then they'd track what happened. And what they found was this. Most people don't break. They split. Their personalities fragment. A primary surface self stays functional, while a deep, silenced core begins screaming beneath. And once that split happens, they're ripe. Ripe for suggestion. Ripe for ideological insertion. Ripe for mass production of belief. This is what they applied next. In education, in news cycles, in entertainment arcs. In self-help psychology, the structure is the same. Disorient, fragment, suggest, normalize. Your attention is the leash, but your confusion is the cage. Because when you feel overwhelmed, uncertain, and unsure of your place in the world, you become vulnerable to any narrative that offers clarity. And they know that. They bank on it. So they keep the world just chaotic enough, just unsafe enough, just ambiguous enough, that your brain starts begging for instruction. That's not dysfunction. That's deliberate design. Division E didn't invent this. They were just the first to apply it at scale. But the real enemy? It's not the government. It's not some shadow elite. It's the systems that wrap around you and whisper, "Be safe. Don't question. Stay small. Trust the script." It's the lie that healing is found in forgetting. But forgetting is how they win. Because if you don't know who you are, you'll believe anything they tell you. We're not done yet. Every system of control begins with a simple idea. The earlier the fracture, the stronger the obedience. They knew this. That's why you were never the target. Your child's self was. And they reached him through the things that were never questioned. Stories, songs, games, rules, smiles that punished you when you stepped outside the line, praise that felt like love, but only came when you performed. Let me ask you this. Who taught you that being good meant being quiet? Who taught you to fear being wrong more than being fake? Who taught you to follow instructions that made no sense, just to avoid punishment? Who convinced you that your value comes from how well you obey? It wasn't your parents. It was the system wrapped around them, passed down like scripture. They didn't even know they were passing the virus. Because long before algorithms, long before television, the greatest tool of psychological conditioning was ritualized repetition. In school, raise your hand, sit still, memorize, repeat, forget, start over. In religion, confess, repent, don't question. Your doubt is sin. Your fear is faith. Your silence is strength. In entertainment, prince saves princess, villain punished. Truth comes from outside you. Follow the arc. Love wins, only if you suffer enough to earn it. They called it innocence, but it was never neutral. Every bedtime story was an architecture. Every lesson about safety was a subliminal directive. Stay in line and you'll be loved. And then came the anchors. Toys that mimicked war. Games that mimicked hierarchy. Rules that punished exploration. Imagination time that ended with a bell. By age 7, most children have already encoded their personality based on external approval. That's not development. That's invisible imprisonment. And here's the most brutal part. The smarter the child, the deeper the fracture. Because a smart child knows something feels wrong, but is too dependent on survival to resist. So he splits. One self to be loved, one self to hide the truth. And that second self, the one you buried, that's the one watching this now. That's the one remembering. You didn't forget what they did. You adapted. And now, you're waking up to the lie. Not because someone told you, but because you're ready to remember what you already knew. This is your exit door. But first, you were never meant to stay obedient forever. That would be too obvious, too easy to detect. No, they planned for your rebellion. They wanted it. Because they knew. Real control doesn't fear resistance. It manufactures it and sells it back to you as freedom. Let me explain. When you were a child, obedience was external. Do what you're told. Be quiet. Fit in. But as you grew, the leash had to evolve. You were getting smarter, more curious, more dangerous. So they shifted the architecture. They gave you brands to wear, movements to join, rebellions to mimic. Punk, grunge, activism, alternative thought. But every one of those came prepackaged, each with a look, a sound, a language, a leader, a target to hate, a narrative to adopt. Suddenly, you weren't just rebelling. You were participating in a rebellion that they already defined. Your hairstyle, your playlist, your independent beliefs, all data points. Your rage, predicted. Your rejection of the system, modeled. And every time you pushed back, they studied, they adjusted, they got smarter. Because it's not about stopping you, it's about channeling you, like water through pipes. Even your language became a prison. Think about it. Success, crazy, normal, disorder, truth, evidence. These aren't neutral words. They're loaded containers, designed to frame your reality. You say truth. But do you mean objective fact or institutional consensus? You say freedom. But do you mean autonomy or permission within allowed parameters? Language is not communication anymore. It's a control grid. Every word you've ever used came with hidden definitions baked in, and those definitions define you. Because when you accept someone else's language, you accept their worldview. And when your rebellion uses their words, you're still in their world. The four brothers of Eldridge, they weren't just isolated. They were re-educated through language cycles. Each week, they were fed stories. They were praised for repeating key phrases, punished when they used words not in the program, until eventually, their thoughts were no longer their own, only constructs, built from scripts they didn't write. And now, ask yourself, how much of what you believe was handed to you in a phrase? Follow your dreams. Live your truth. Trust the science. Do your part. Be kind. Who wrote those for you? And why? Language didn't just describe your world, it built the walls of your cage. And the only way out? You have to learn to see the script before you speak it. We're not done yet. Look around you. Every culture has its temples, not made of stone, but of screens. The modern cathedral doesn't require silence. It demands attention. And the high priests, they wear suits at 6 p.m., costumes on sound stages, and smiles that never reach the eyes. You call it media. You call it fiction. You call it just a cartoon, just a movie, just the news. But everything they show you is built on one truth. If they control the story, they control the mind. Let's start with the news. Every night a congregation gathers. Eyes forward, hands still, mind open. They are baptized in fear, initiated through repetition, and granted salvation through authority. They don't inform, they install. Notice the rhythm. Crisis, expert, response, relief. You feel helpless. They give a voice. You feel scared. They give you a target. You feel confused. They give you clarity. Packaged, polished, and pre-approved. This is not information. It's a belief ritual. And then, there's Hollywood. You grew up on it, slept to its voices, laughed with its symbols, dreamed through its narratives. You think it was harmless. Then why do you remember every character's name, but not your childhood dreams? Because that's how deep the scripts went. The hero's journey. The good versus evil dichotomy. The broken man healed only through external validation. The chosen one saved by destiny, not discipline. They didn't tell stories. They told you who you're allowed to become. Even your rebellious icons were manufactured. The badass still followed the script. The rule breaker still found redemption through conformity. The truth seeker always ended up back in the fold, because every story ends the same way. You are small. The system is large. Trust the experts. Emotions are truth. Hope is found in obedience. Even cartoons. Ever wonder why children's shows feature so much chaos, fast cuts, screaming voices, illogical patterns? It's not entertainment. It's cognitive conditioning, training the brain to accept overstimulation, emotional randomness, and fractured attention. Why? Because a fragmented mind can't question, and a distracted child becomes a compliant adult. They knew what they were doing, from the colors, to the music, to the archetypes repeated over and over. It was theater, but the audience was in trance. And that trance? It never really ended. Even now, it's hard for you to feel the edges of your own thoughts, to separate what you believe from what you were told to love. But that's what awakening is. Not comfort, not peace, but violent clarity. The moment you realize you've been watching their play your whole life and mistaking it for your story. The only way out is to become the writer. Before man wrote laws, before we spoke language, we carved symbols. And those symbols didn't just represent meaning, they generated behavior. Why? Because the subconscious doesn't think in sentences. It thinks in patterns, in shapes, in associations. So when they wanted to build a system you wouldn't question, they didn't hide it. They showed it to you everywhere, over and over, until your mind bowed and your will stopped asking why. Let's begin with corporate logos. You think it's just branding? A clean font? A catchy shape? Look closer. Triangles pointing upward. Masculine, aggressive, dominance, downward, submission, occult, secrecy. Circles, unity, endless cycles, containment, spirals, evolution or descent, depending on direction. Eyes, awareness, surveillance, divinity, or control. Ever wonder why some of the biggest brands on earth use ancient geometry? Because they're not just selling products, they're anchoring perception. Think of the Apple logo, a bitten fruit. That's not innovation, that's Eden, that's knowledge stolen and punished. You carry the fall in your pocket and call it progress. Now look at the architecture of the cities you walk through. Why do government buildings mimic Roman temples? Why do financial districts build monoliths, towers, and spires, shaped like obelisks? Because power echoes itself through form. And every time you pass those structures, your body remembers the hierarchy, even if your mind doesn't. You feel small. They feel eternal. That's design, not coincidence. Even popular culture is saturated in code. Music videos that flash Masonic symbols, films that repeat ritual imagery, sacrifice, ascension, rebirth. Why? Because repetition is invocation. When millions focus on the same symbols, fear, lust, death, adoration, those symbols don't just inform, they activate. You begin to associate emotions with the signal, until that signal becomes a command. A triangle doesn't mean power. It feels like power. An eye doesn't mean surveillance. It feels like being watched. And once that feeling is installed, you don't need the actual cage. The symbol itself becomes the prison. So when you scroll, when you watch, when you walk, ask yourself, what am I being told? Without words. Because if you don't choose your symbols, they will be chosen for you. And if you don't decode what you see, you'll become what they designed you to be. Passive, predictable, programmed. But here's the shift. You can reclaim the symbols, recode the patterns, retake the shapes. But first, you have to see them clearly. Look at your life. Waking, working, eating, sleeping. Repeat. You think that's normal? It's not. It's designed. Because time, the very thing you think is natural, has been weaponized. Let's begin here. The 7-day week? That's not biological. It's not cosmic. It's Babylonian. They carved time into sevens to reflect ancient astrological cycles. Not because it served humanity, but because it created predictable labor and obedient worship. Centuries later, empires refined it. Religions sanctified it. Corporations optimized it. And now, you live inside it. Each day with a label. Each hour with a demand. Each minute pulling you away from your inner rhythm. And back into the grind. What happens when you live by a calendar you didn't choose? You lose intuition. You lose cycles. You lose the natural rise and fall of energy, creativity, rest. Instead, you're told to be productive on Monday, social on Friday, numb on Sunday. Repeat until death. Your burnout is not weakness. It's a symptom of living in a machine you weren't built for. Even the clock. Think about it. Why does it move in circles? Because it mimics the ritual wheel. Round and round. Never ending. But here's the trick. They split the circle into 12 hours, twice. Why 12? Because 12 is a ritual number, 12 months, 12 disciples, 12 tribes, 12 zodiac signs. It's not for accuracy. It's for symmetry. A ritual architecture that frames your reality. And every tick is a reminder. You're late. You're behind. You're not doing enough. They've made time your enemy when it should have been your ally. And it goes deeper. School bells. Modeled after factory whistles. Training children to obey industrial rhythms. Lunch breaks. Calibrated to maximize output, not nutrition. Vacations. Designed not for rest, but to reset you just enough to return willingly. Even aging itself has been hijacked. You were told, childhood is preparation. Adulthood is productivity. Old age is uselessness. That's not biology, that's a capitalist sacrament. So here's the question no one asks. What would your life feel like without their time? What would rise in you if you listened to internal seasons instead of external schedules? Would you still grind 9 to 5? Would you still fear 40? Would you still beg Friday to save you? Or would you finally start living on your own frequency? This isn't romanticism. This is revolution. Because until you reclaim your time, you don't own your life. You think your thoughts are your own? That your moods, your urges, your energy belong to you? Let's dismantle that illusion. Because somewhere along the line, you stopped being a sovereign system and became a reactive shell, flooded with compounds you never agreed to. Start here. What's in your food, your water, your air? Do you really know? Or were you told it's safe by the same industries who profit when you're tired, anxious, docile, and distracted? Let's talk hormonal sabotage. Testosterone, the molecule of drive, ambition, aggression, clarity, is in free fall. Men today have less than half the testosterone levels their grandfathers did. Why? Plastics, soy, pesticides, microtoxins, blue light, sleep disruption, chronic stress, and worst of all, endocrine disruptors. Hidden in packaging, soaps, deodorants. Quietly feminizing, pacifying, and sedating you from the inside out. This isn't accidental. It's long-range warfare. A powerful man questions. A weak man obeys. So they told you strength is toxic. That aggression is primitive. That masculinity is a threat. And while you apologized for existing, they made billions off your fatigue. Now look at your dopamine. The neurotransmitter of desire. now hijacked. Social media? Engineered to spike and crash it. Porn? Saturates it until real intimacy feels boring. Junk food? Creates artificial highs and emotional lows. They've turned your pleasure system into a casino, where you chase rewards you never win, until exhaustion feels like home. Addiction isn't failure. It's the system working exactly as designed. You weren't made to scroll endlessly, to binge, to consume. You were made to create, to build, to fight, to love, with clarity. But they can't have that. So they numbed the flame, flooded your system, and sold you comfort, while they stole your vitality. Even pharmaceuticals play their role. Antidepressants, stimulants, sleep aids. One to numb the pain, one to keep working, one to forget what's missing. A loop of dependence, masked as healing. And while your body fights to signal that something is wrong, you're told it's you who's broken. No, you're not broken. You're chemically suppressed. But here's the crack in the wall. Your body is not their property. And when you start feeding it truth, moving with intention, sleeping with rhythm, breathing with presence, the fog begins to lift, the fire returns, and their grip loosens. You were born free. Not just physically, but mentally, unshaped, unnamed, undefined. A blank manuscript of potential. But very early on, they gave you something. Not tools, not truths, but a name, a role, a script. You are this. You belong here. You don't belong there. Stay within the lines. And from that moment on, your life became a maze, not of choice, but of permission. Because the greatest control system of all is identity. Not who you are, but who they taught you to believe you are. They built it layer by layer. Nationality, as if borders define your worth. Race, as if color is character. Class, as if wealth equals value. Gender roles, not based on power, but on restraint. Politics, a prepackaged morality menu. Religion, often weaponized into guilt and division. And most insidiously, they gave you labels. Lazy, smart, angry, quiet, ADD, depressed, alpha, beta. All meant to reduce complexity to compliance. Because when you believe your identity is fixed, you stop growing, you stop questioning, you self-police. That's the trick. They don't need guards. They just need you to hold your own leash. It's why rebellion feels wrong, why ambition feels selfish, why confidence feels dangerous. They encoded guilt into self-awareness and obedience into self-perception. But here's the break in the code. You are not your thoughts. You are not your past. You are not their roles, their diagnoses, their names. You are something older, something they couldn't fully kill. And that's why they fear your awakening. Because once you realize your identity is programmable, you can rewrite the code. Not to become someone else, but to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. And as you awaken, the system shivers. Because it only works if you stay asleep. The mind is a weapon, but most were taught to use it like a diary, not a blade. They fed you emotions as truth, told you trauma is identity, told you self-love meant avoiding struggle and seeking comfort. And now, we have men drowning in chaos, calling it freedom. But you're not here to cope. You're here to command. So let's begin the reclamation. First, silence. Not scrolling, not numbing. Silence. Because your mind has become a market. Every thought, a product. Every reaction, a bid. You're not thinking. You're consuming thoughts that weren't yours to begin with. So sit, in the quiet, and watch. See how quickly distraction creeps in? That's where the programming hides. Discipline begins where silence becomes unbearable. Second, attention control. Do you know where your focus is right now? Because focus is currency. And the elite? They spend yours, while hoarding theirs. You must guard your attention like a king guards his citadel. No more mindless media, emotional scrolling, debates with broken people, dopamine traps disguised as connection. Because every moment you give to noise, you abandon the throne. Third, philosophical strength. They gave you slogans. You need principles. What do you believe about suffering? About power? About truth? About self-mastery? If you don't define those, they will. With memes, with media, with manipulation dressed as morality. Write your code. Live by it. Die by it, if necessary. Because a man without philosophy is a weapon waiting to be used by someone else. And finally, solitude. Not loneliness. Solitude. Time spent forging the inner man, because you can't rise in the world until you've risen in your mind. No mentor, no God, no government can save you. But the moment you stop asking to be saved, you become unstoppable. They told you to live in the moment, to enjoy the now, to not think too far ahead. Tomorrow is uncertain, they whispered, but that's not what they do. The ruling class, the bloodline families, the ancient dynasties, they don't live in the moment. They live in centuries. Their wealth isn't in currency. It's in legacy. Their focus isn't on this generation. It's on the seventh. And while you were taught to chase pleasure, they were practicing rituals of permanence. Let me show you how deep this goes. Start with names you know. The Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, the Windsors, the Vatican lineages, all with archives of power passed from father to son, not as inheritance, but as duty. Every generation trained, molded, ritually initiated. Because wealth alone isn't enough. You need myth, symbol, binding oaths, to keep a family loyal to an invisible throne for hundreds of years. This is where occult tradition enters. Not the cartoonish magic they show the masses, but real ancient systems of energy manipulation, archetypal invocation, and ritual calendar mastery. You think that's fiction? Why then are so many elite compounds, from Bohemian Grove to Chateau d'Hôtel, designed with ritual geometry, symbolic sculptures, and private chapels? Why do their estates align with equinoxes? Why do their children attend secret schools with Latin mottos you can't even translate? Because they understand what you were never allowed to learn. That belief, symbolism, and ritual, when repeated over generations, create unbreakable currents of power. Now look at your family. What have you inherited? Debt? Confusion? Ancestral trauma? That was the point. Because if your bloodline is kept traumatized and distracted, you'll never build for your grandchildren. You'll never think beyond your next paycheck. That's the trap, and they've spent centuries ensuring tolds. But you're here now, and awakening you is dangerous, because if one man reclaims the sacred knowledge of Longview legacy, he can build a dynasty that fractures the machine. Let's be honest. Most people today believe they're free. They vote, they shop, they scroll, they speak. But freedom isn't about choices. It's about who created those choices and why. And what if I told you, you don't live in a democracy. You live in a behavioral prison, engineered to keep you emotionally distracted and psychologically tamed, all while believing you're in control. Let's take it layer by layer. Politics. Left versus right, red versus blue, good cop, bad cop. with a shared boss you'll never meet. Each election is theater. Each debate, a ritual of division. Because if they keep you focused on personalities, you'll never look at the policies that never change. Perpetual war, centralized banking, corporate lobbying, surveillance expansion, public obedience. Different face. Same machine. Now, media. You think you choose what you watch? No. You consume what algorithms push, trained by black box systems you'll never decode. And the free press? 5 corporations own 90% of what you see, read, and hear. Their goal isn't to inform, it's to influence. Crisis fatigue, outrage addiction, manufactured division, emotional baiting. Because a divided, exhausted public never rebels. Education? Built in the image of the industrial age. Bells, desks, obedience, memorization. It was never designed to awaken genius. It was designed to produce employees. Even social media. The thing that feels most free. It's a panopticon. A digital prison where you surveil yourself. You broadcast your identity. You reveal your desires. You share your location. You rate your own value through likes and views. And worst of all, you become addicted to visibility. Craving attention becomes your prison. And in that craving, you never question the walls around you. This is not freedom. This is perfect slavery with neon lights. But here's the twist. The more ye outsee the system, the harder it is for it to hold you. Because awareness is the first crack in the facade. And once the illusion breaks, there's no going back. You've felt it, haven't you? That strange tension. When a Super Bowl halftime show doesn't just feel like a concert, but a ritual. When a building gives you chills you can't explain. When a logo feels like it's watching you back. You're not imagining it. Because the elite don't just rule through banks and bullets. They rule through symbol. Symbols bypass logic. They speak directly to your subconscious. And that's where real control lives. Let's start with architecture. Ever notice how the Capitol building, the Vatican, and Freemason lodges all share eerily similar layouts? Domes, obelisks, checkerboard floors. Sacred geometry from ancient Babylon, Egypt, and Rome. Resurrected not for beauty, but for power alignment. Because to them, architecture is ritual in stone. Each angle, each pillar, each axis, calibrated to invoke archetypes. Obelisks for male energy, domes for womb power, triangles for hierarchical force, circles for eternity and binding. These aren't decorations. They're conduits. Now look at the corporate world. Why does nearly every tech, bank, and media giant use all-seeing eyes, pyramids, or circles with hidden sigils? Think of the Google Chrome logo, 3 sixes in a spiral. The CBS eye, a modern Horus. The Amazon arrow, a smirk, or a ritualistic A to Z binding loop. These aren't coincidences. They're silent oaths, worn like badges, declaring loyalty to systems far older than the corporations themselves. And then there's Hollywood, the real ministry of spellwork. Award shows with checkerboard floors, red rituals, phoenix flames, black and white duality, and inverted crosses, all cloaked as art. But what you're witnessing is energy harvesting. Each performance, a public offering. Each outfit, a coded invocation. Each chant, ritualistic reaffirmation of the order's grip. Now ask yourself, why do the same shapes, colors, and numbers show up across nations, industries, and centuries? Because they're not just decorating the world, they're programming it. And by seeing these symbols repeatedly, without awareness, your subconscious begins to submit. You begin to internalize the hierarchy. But when you see them, really see them, you break the spell. Because a symbol only controls the unaware. And now, you're aware. You were taught that history is linear, that time is measured, precise, and neutral, that the past is behind you, and the future is coming in order. But that is a myth. Because those who rule the world also rule the clock. What if I told you time isn't just counted, it's controlled, edited, and weaponized? Let's begin with a question you were never meant to ask. Why is our calendar the way it is? Months, 365 days, leap years, BC and AD. Did you ever stop and wonder who created this system? The Gregorian calendar, the one used by most of the world, was engineered by papal decree in 1582, replacing the Julian calendar. But why? And what changed? Days were erased, literally deleted from history. The people of that time went to sleep on October 4th and woke up on October 15th. And just like that, time was rewritten. This wasn't a fix. It was a reset. And that's not the only one. There are entire lost centuries, phantom time, that some historians argue never even happened. The years 614 to 911 AD may have been fabricated, invented to legitimize emperors and religious authority. This is the phantom time hypothesis. It sounds insane until you look closer. Ancient buildings dated to the 10th century show 13th century tech. Historical figures are duplicated under different names. Records of massive events missing. And here's the deeper truth. Timekeeping was never about accuracy. It was about authority. Because when you control the past, you control people's story. And when you control the story, you control their identity. Ask yourself, why are entire civilizations, like Tartaria, erased or dismissed? Why are megalithic structures around the world older than history says possible? Why do myths of a great reset, a flood, a world before ours, echo across every culture? Because we've been placed inside a fabricated timeline, a manipulated chronology where only their version survives. They've redefined ancient to make you feel disconnected from your real past. They took your ancestors' glory and buried it in the sands of prehistory. You've been told you're a modern man, when in truth, you are the descendant of forgotten gods. But to awaken that, you must first break the spell of time. Before you were born, before your father's father, before history as you know it, there was something else. Not a civilization, a dominion. The remnants are still here. Not in textbooks, but in stone. Cyclopean walls in Peru, with seams tighter than a machine can carve. Submerged pyramids off the coast of Yonaguni. Gigantic staircases in the Caucasus, too large for any modern man. These aren't ruins. They're survivors. But survivors of what? Your teachers said, primitive man. But primitive men don't build with megalithic precision. They don't align monuments to star systems with math we just rediscovered. They don't move stones that weigh hundreds of tons without modern cranes. So who did? And more importantly, why were they erased? Here's what you're not told. There are signs, everywhere, of an antediluvian intelligence. A species or force that walked the earth before our timeline began. Call them what you want. The Watchers, the Nephilim, the Builders, the Serpent Kings, names change. But the pattern stays. These beings knew things. Star codes, resonance frequencies, astral alignments, vibration-based construction. Knowledge now labeled myth. They didn't just build empires. They shaped consciousness. And when the Great Reset came, the flood, the fire, the tilt of the axis, their world was shattered. But some of them survived. And their bloodlines didn't vanish. They hid. They integrated. Became priests. Then kings. then presidents. Why do you think nearly every ruling dynasty traces its ancestry to the same mysterious lines? Why are ancient serpent cults encoded into modern elite symbolism? Because the old ones are not gone. They're just wearing human masks. You were taught to believe in randomness. That life is an accident. That your DNA just happened to form. That consciousness is a glitch in a meat machine. But here's the secret. Nothing about you is random, especially your design. Let's talk about your DNA. The double helix, the sacred coil, is more than just a blueprint. It's an antenna. It stores memory, processes emotion, and responds to sound and light. Certain frequencies can activate dormant parts of your genome, parts labeled by modern science as junk. But ask yourself, why would nature carry useless code for millions of years? It wouldn't. That junk, that's locked potential. And someone locked it. Now let's talk about ancient texts. Across Mesopotamia, Sumer, Egypt, the Vedas, the Book of Enoch, one story keeps repeating. A sky-born race, gods, angels, beings of fire and light, came down and intervened in human evolution. They didn't just observe. They mixed their essence with ours. They bred giants. They taught metallurgy, astrology, warfare. They gave symbols and demanded worship. These weren't metaphors. They were encounters. Why else do so many cultures describe them with such precision? Flying discs, fiery chariots, glowing eyes, advanced tools, language that could command nature itself, and when these beings left, or were banished, their followers kept their secrets and used them to shape empires. Now enter modern science. It's not that they don't know, it's that they can't admit it. Because if humanity was engineered, then the engineers still exist. And if the engineers exist, then someone must be in contact. Look at the sudden leaps in technology. From horse carriages to nuclear weapons in 1 century. From radio to quantum computing in 1 generation. This isn't natural progression. It's drip-fed acceleration. The elite don't fear disclosure because of panic. They fear it because if you knew who you really are, if you remembered what you were designed to be, you would never kneel again. You believe your thoughts are your own. But they aren't. Because long before you formed opinions, someone was installing the framework. From the lullabies you were sung to the cartoons you watched, from the history you were taught to the dreams you were allowed to have, your reality was constructed. Not by accident, not by culture, but by design. What you think is free will is often programmed preference. Let's start with the basics. Your mind runs on patterns, heuristics, belief systems, archetypes. The priests of old used myth and symbol to install moral authority. The corporate elite now use branding and screens to do the same. They don't tell you what to think. They tell you what to fear, what to desire, and what to never question. And they do it through repetition. Every day, thousands of inputs, ads, headlines, songs, logos, pass your conscious filter. But your subconscious absorbs all of it. It doesn't judge. It records. So when a certain belief feels true, like money equals success, or obedience is safety, that's not proof. That's conditioning. Why do you think every empire in history focused first on controlling education, language, and narratives? Because once you install a mental OS in a child, you never need chains. The cage is internal. Let's go deeper. Think of the psyops you weren't taught about. Operation Mockingbird, CIA infiltration of media, Project MK Ultra, actual mind control experiments on civilians, behavioral economics, nudging, predictive programming, soft manipulation in plain sight. They're not hiding it. They're counting on you being too busy, too distracted, too broken to notice. And the final weapon? Shame. The system doesn't silence you by force. It teaches you to silence yourself, to mock your own instincts, to reject your inner voice. Because a man at war with himself is no threat to the 3-1. But once you see the code, once you realize your mind has been hacked, you begin the only rebellion that matters. Inner sovereignty. Do you know what your most valuable resource is? Not your time, not your money, not even your vote. It's your attention. Because where your attention goes, your energy flows. And those who rule this world want nothing more than to own your gaze. They don't need to enslave your body. They already have your eyes, your scroll, your dopamine loop. Why do you think your phone never leaves your hand? Why every platform is built on infinite scroll, notifications, and algorithmic hypnosis? Because distraction isn't just a side effect. It's the main feature. The more fragmented your attention, the less power you have to direct your own life. And if you can't direct your life, someone else will. Let's trace this ancient art of distraction warfare. The Roman Empire gave citizens bread and circuses, cheap food and violent entertainment, to keep them docile. Today, it's fast food and streaming apps. Same mechanism, different screen. They weaponize novelty, flashing headlines, endless stimuli, social conflict, not to inform you, but to exhaust you. A man who's exhausted doesn't resist. He doesn't plan. He doesn't pray. He doesn't revolt. He complies. And that's the trap. But the solution? It's older than any empire. It's called presence. When you train your attention, when you reclaim your focus, you begin to deprogram the noise. You begin to remember who you were before the world told you who to be. Because attention is more than survival. It's sacred. It's the currency of your soul. It's what ancient mystics used to see beyond the veil. It's what visionaries used to rewire the world. And once you reclaim it, no algorithm, no psyop. From the moment you were born, your life was scripted. A name you didn't choose. A nation you didn't agree to. A flag, a language, a belief system. All downloaded before you could walk. And then, the program begins. Be quiet, obey, fit in, perform, consume, sleep, repeat. You weren't raised to awaken. You were domesticated, like cattle. Everything in your environment was engineered to keep you comfortable enough to never ask why. Why does the world feel hollow? Why do we chase goals that leave us emptier? Why does no one seem to remember who they are? Here's the answer. You're not living in a society. You're living in a containment system. A system so advanced it doesn't use chains. It uses choice. You're allowed to pick your team, your flavor, your screens, your career path, as long as you never leave the cage. And the cage is this: mass unconsciousness. Most people are asleep, eyes open, but spiritually sedated, dulled by propaganda, poisoned by culture, medicated by convenience. They feel the discomfort, but they run from it. They laugh at truth, mock depth, scroll past anything that might force them to see, because seeing means killing the false self, and that's terrifying. But you didn't scroll away, you stayed. Because a part of you remembers what you were before the conditioning, before the forgetting. You were sovereign, you were aware, you were dangerous, and that's why they fear awakening. Because one awakened man is more powerful than 1,000 obedient ones. He sees the lie. He walks away from it. He builds his own axis. This is the moment you choose. Do you return to the illusion, or do you keep going, deeper into the forbidden, beneath every government, every empire, every multinational throne, there is a ritual. Not a tradition, not a holiday, a coded rite, older than any constitution. Because power, real power, is never random. It's inherited. It's initiated. It's sealed in blood. You think elections matter? You think CEOs rise by merit? No. They are placed, chosen by the same ancient hand that has ruled since Sumer, Babylon, Kemet, and Rome. And every generation, that hand performs the same rites, hidden in pageantry, wrapped in nationalism, masked by charity. But underneath, they're still sacrificing, not always bodies, but symbols, intent, energy. Let's decode. Why do coronations follow astrological alignments? Why do presidents place hands on Bibles they don't believe in, while reciting oaths written in dead languages? Why do major events, assassinations, invasions, financial crashes, often occur on occult calendars? Because they're not just managing the world, they're ritually binding it. Look deeper. The obelisks in Washington, D.C. The Masonic layout of city grids. The all-seeing eye on your dollar bill. The inverted pentagram on intelligence agency insignias. These aren't coincidences. They're sigils. Magical emblems used to focus intent. Ask yourself, why would the world's most rational elites embed ancient pagan geometry into their power centers? Why would tech titans meditate with Vedic priests and invest in occult AI startups? Because they know what you were trained to forget. Symbols aren't decoration. They're technology. They bypass logic and speak directly to the subconscious. And when enough people feed a symbol their attention, it becomes a vessel. This is why empires fall when their myths are broken. Not because they lose soldiers, but because they lose the spell. Now let's talk about bloodlines. From pharaohs to popes, from czar, to presidents. There's a reason so many leaders share ancestral DNA. The same few families keep showing up in finance, media, politics, royalty. Why? Because they believe blood remembers. That through ritual, lineage, and secrecy, they preserve a link to something pre-human. Something that whispered from the dark before nations even existed. Something that still whispers now. Every year, some of the most powerful men on Earth vanish into remote forests, private castles, or ultra-secure mountain lodges. No cameras, no press, no records. Just ritual, networking, and the kind of conversations that change history without ever being documented. You're told it's all business. Just policy retreats. Private conferences. But when the richest, most influential, and most unaccountable people on the planet gather in secret, away from courts, laws, and public eyes, that's not democracy, that's ritual governance. Let's talk about what actually happens. At Bohemian Grove, they gather under a 40-foot owl statue named Moloch. They wear robes. They light fires. They simulate sacrifices. All while figures from politics, banking, Hollywood, and tech sit and watch. Some say it's just theater. But theater is the oldest tool of invocation. The Greeks knew this. The Egyptians practiced it. Acting is how archetypes are summoned. You channel energy through performance, and what you rehearse becomes reality. In these private circles, they don't just discuss the world. They script it. Policy papers become prophesies. Stock forecasts become spells. Agreements made in silence become laws by next winter. And you were never in the room. Ask yourself, why does no mainstream media outlet investigate these gatherings? Why are the guest lists so tightly protected? Because every outlet you trust is owned by 6 companies. And those companies have seats at these very tables. It goes further. There are private councils that don't even make the conspiracy blogs. Groups so secretive, so elite, they don't meet annually. They meet when the timeline shifts. Pandemics, currency resets, technological leaps, wars. They gather in times of threshold to decide who profits, who rules, and who gets sacrificed. They don't believe in nations. They believe in timelines. And they work to engineer outcomes using media as their voice, finance as their weapon, and fear as their fuel. This is why nothing ever just happens. It's rehearsed, pre-modeled, often simulated months in advance. Control is not maintained by chaos. It's maintained by the illusion of chaos. So you're too confused to resist, too divided to unite, too tired to think. But if you've made it this far, you're not confused anymore. You're awakening. It was a brutal winter in Labette County. The snow fell like ash. The wind carried no warmth, just silence and suspicion. The Bender family. That's the name that made the papers. But that was the smokescreen. A name for the surface story. Behind the Bloody Benders legend was something far older than crime. It was ritual. 4 siblings, John, Elvira, John Jr., and Kate, the Benders. Except, none of them were actually related. Not by blood, not by name. And according to later records, not by identity either. Locals described them as odd, stiff in speech, too quiet, too precise. Kate, in particular, was rumored to have uncanny abilities. Speaking to the dead, predicting births and disasters, and hypnotizing travelers into forgetting. But what really disturbed witnesses wasn't what she said. It was how people felt around her. Dizzy, detached, like they were watching their lives from outside their own skulls. And then, people began to disappear. Dozens of travelers, all men, vanished without a trace between 1871 and 1873. When the farm was finally raided, 11 bodies were found, buried under the floorboards, throats slit, skulls crushed, all seated at the same dinner table. But the question that haunts historians isn't what they did. It's why they did it. Because when investigators examined the bodies, they found a strange pattern. No valuables taken. Meals left untouched. Candles positioned around the room in geomantic alignment. And on the walls, hidden behind wooden panels, symbols scorched into the beams. Not Christian, not native, but Phoenician. That's not just odd. It's impossible. Those characters hadn't been used in over 2,000 years, and were never taught in the American frontier. So how did a girl in Kansas know them? Unless she wasn't just a girl, unless this family wasn't just a group of killers, but operatives, not milit, or not governmental. Something else. Something older. Multiple reports describe chanting before the killings. A repeated phrase, transcribed phonetically, resembling a Babylonian invocation. And get this. The moment they fled, every trace of them vanished. No trails, no sightings, no captured suspects, ever. Almost as if they were pulled out, removed. Like chess pieces at the end of a completed ritual. The killings stopped. The house was burned, and the records sealed. And yet, one detail remained. Every single victim was an educated man. Writers, professors, engineers, traveling west to establish infrastructure. Why target them? Unless the Benders weren't just killing. They were delaying something. Preventing something. What infrastructure were they trying to stop? The 4 men who died on that Kansas farm weren't just travelers. They were surveyors, cartographers, civil engineers, each working for a quiet post-war initiative known as the Continental Grid. Not a railroad, not a telegraph line, but something far stranger. A national geometric network of underground shafts, copper-lined tunnels, and stone markers designed to trace ley lines across North America. You weren't taught this in school, because they buried the history with the bodies. But fragments of government contracts, hidden in archives and mislabeled as civil land assessments, tell a different story. A hidden directive, signed by a little-known reconstruction official, mapped out a plan to build 33 underground terminals across the country, each spaced according to sacred geometry, echoing patterns found in Egypt, Peru, and Mesopotamia. Why? Because someone believed the land itself held ancient energy, a force that could be tapped, not for electricity, but for influence. Influence over thought, over memory, over behavior. You think that's a stretch? Then explain this. The locations chosen for these terminals, many of them became sites of massive trauma within 50 years. Waco, Oklahoma City, Columbine, Sandy Hook. Coincidence? Or were these activation points, feeding on collective fear? Now back to Kansas, that stretch of land where the Bender farmhouse stood. It was one of the terminal sites, a convergence point. And those 4 men, they were sent to complete it. But something, or someone, stopped them. The Benders weren't mad. They were assigned. By who? That's the real question. Some say they were part of a counter-order, a remnant of an ancient priesthood that believed certain nodes must never be activated, lest they awaken something that sleeps beneath. Others believe they were possessed, not by evil, but by memory itself, a memory older than language, using them as instruments to delay humanity's fall into its own shadow. But here's what we know for sure. After the murders, the project halted. That terminal was never completed. The area was bought by a shell company, and the blueprints erased from all public record, until fragments were leaked in 2003 by a whistleblower who vanished 2 weeks later. His final message? They're building the grid again, this time with satellites. The Earth is the circuit, and the signal is coming. The old architects worked with stone and copper, but the new ones use code. After the original continental grid was shut down, those in power didn't abandon the idea. They upgraded it. What couldn't be completed physically was re-engineered digitally. Fiber optics replaced the tunnels. Satellites replaced the obelisks. Data replaced blood. And the human nervous system, your nervous system, became the new conduit. You're already feeling it. You wake up exhausted. You forget what you were doing mid-thought. You feel like time is collapsing, like years pass in weeks. That's not just modern life. It's a frequency field, subtle, continuous, and omnipresent. They don't need wires in your skull anymore. They have notifications. They have loops. They have algorithmic sorcery. What was once done in ritual chambers is now done with your own thumbs. They don't need to imprison you. They've programmed you to build your own cell. Scroll by scroll, tap by tap. Every action you take online feeds the grid. But this is deeper than surveillance. This is harmonic control. In 2018, a leaked DARPA memo described a project codenamed NEAth, a neural resonance initiative designed to map individual emotional frequencies in real time, using passive tech, phones, smart TVs, even Bluetooth devices. The goal? To synchronize population mood with desired timelines, by subtly modulating public anxiety, desire, fear. They steer collective behavior without orders or laws. Riots, compliance, addictions, obedience, all shaped not through speeches, but through an invisible symphony of frequencies. And the final layer? Dream manipulation. They've known for decades that dream states are programmable. The Soviets tried it. The CIA tried it. Now, big tech runs it. Those ads you saw before bed? They bleed into your dreams. Those sounds your smart device emitted while you slept, they're not random. You're being tuned, gently, nightly, consistently, until the memory of who you are becomes a shadow. And the story you're living is one you never consented to. That's why you're here. To wake up. To disconnect the myth they've wired into your spine. Everything you were taught was designed to keep you obedient, distracted, and most of all, disconnected. From your history. From your instinct. From your power. They taught you history was random. A parade of accidents and geniuses, wars and revolutions. But that's not true. History is curated, edited, polished, scripted to keep you from seeing the patterns. Because if you saw the patterns, you'd ask the forbidden question, who benefits? Not you, not your ancestors, not your bloodline, but them. The same nameless elites who buried the Bender's truth in Kansas, who rebuilt the grid inside your phone, who whisper behind sealed oak doors while the world burns. They've ruled not with swords, but with forgetting. They erased entire civilizations from memory. Have you ever wondered why you know the name of Julius Caesar, but not the name of the man who invented writing? Why you know Napoleon's height, but not what the Library of Alexandria truly contained? Because knowledge is currency, and forgetting is control. The more you forget, the more they shape your choices. You don't choose your thoughts. You inherit them, from the algorithms that guide your feeds to the textbooks that shaped your childhood. This is the prison, not bars, not walls, but beliefs. Beliefs that tell you, you're small, you're powerless, the world is meaningless, you must obey. But the truth is this. You were born into a war you couldn't see, a war for memory, for awareness, for your soul. And now you've seen it. You've seen how the Bender murders were a signal, how the grid was never abandoned, only digitized. How your dreams are shaped by strangers with access to your heartbeat. You've seen the machine, and more importantly, you've heard the silence behind it, the part that trembles when a man remembers who he is. So now, I leave you with this. If you felt something awaken, if this descent through darkness has stirred something inside you, comment below. I remember what they tried to erase. I remember what they tried to erase. Twice. Not for me. For you. To claim your awareness. To signal the algorithm, not just theirs, but yours, that you've woken up. This is Buried Ledger. And this was just the beginning. More stories await. More lies to burn. More forgotten truths to resurrect. You're not just a viewer. You're an initiated witness now. And the ledger? It's wide open. Waiting for you.